Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Avdiivka, where we see here that the Russians have made a significant advance of almost 10 square kilometers, where they've managed to capture Tonenke, the majority of Orelivka and Beredeshi. With this, the Russians have been able to completely push out the Ukrainians from this first line of defense after Avdiivka onto the second one, which goes from Berdishi all the way through Semenivka and down south to Umenske. With this, the Russians are now getting closer and closer to entering and infiltrating this second line of defense by capturing Berdishi, which they have captured over half of the village, which would allow them to attack Semenivka from multiple directions and ignore the height advantage that the Ukrainians have with these positions. Considering the fact that Berdishi itself is also on the heights, the Russians can move through the heights towards Semenivka and allow them to attack it from the high grounds as well. Combine it with a attack from the south where the Russians would be able to launch a pincer maneuver on Semenivka. At the same time, the Russians also have the control over the majority of Tonenke, with just a few dacha area to the northwest of the village still in the gray zone, and with that the Russians can start launching attacks towards the heights here from the southern parts, allowing them to gain a foothold here as well, and likely push in a western direction away from Tonenke towards the open fields here to the west to expand their zone of control over the area, which would allow for future operations towards Yasno-Brodivka here to the west and Netailova here to the south. The Ukrainians have significant fortifications all throughout the reservoir and river areas here, as well as in the positions to the north. So the Russian focus right now is on the second line of defense and the positions here to the south. As we can see here with the fortifications in the direction of Avdiivka, by the reservoir there are simply a lot of fortifications and all the way through the northern parts, all throughout that area. But here to the second line of defense, the British Semenivka Umanska direction, as well as Yasno-Brodivka, they all have a few fortifications, but not a lot. And at the same time, with the height advantage being gone due to the Russians capturing Berdishi, the Ukrainians would hardly have any form of defense in this second line of defense and will likely be forced to withdraw to the third line of defense. And this is actually a major issue for the Ukrainians, considering that the area between Semenivka and Novoselivka Persia, which is the closest to these villages here to the southeast, is a long distance through open fields. As long as the Russians simply have drone reconnaissance in this area all the time, then any Ukrainian units withdrawing from Semenivka, withdrawing from Umanske, would be under artillery fire by the Russians. This means that the withdrawal that they've been doing from village to village through Sheverne, Tonenko, Orelivka, Lostishkine to Orelivka, down to Semenivka and so on, cannot be done again. This time the Ukrainians would have to withdraw from open fields, through open fields. So without armored vehicles, if they have to withdraw on foot again, they would be extremely vulnerable in that withdrawal, and the Russians would be able to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians, which means that the Ukrainians would likely either receive armored vehicles to withdraw, which was necessary to avoid heavy casualties, or they would use this second line of defense as a final line of defense and simply hold on to it as much as possible for as long as possible to win time for the rest of them, but sacrificing themselves in the process. With that, we also see that there are developments here to the south in the direction of Nevelske, where the Russians have reached the outskirts of the village for the first time since the war began. And this likely means that the Russians will look to capture the village of Nevelske. Capturing that would again leave the Ukrainians in a huge area with nothing but open fields, a few fortifications here and there. But largely it means that the Russians would be able to continue pushing here in the Pervomaisk direction and also make use of, if we take a look at the south of Pervomaisk, we see that there's several fortifications between Netailova, Pervomaisk and Nevelske. But if the Russians were to push through the northern parts after the capture of Nevelske, they'll be able to flank these fortifications. But we already see that the fortifications are made in a sense that even if they were flanked, they would still be able to protect themselves. And they are close proximity to each other, so they can work together, all three of them. And as such, the Russians would have a difficult time pushing through these fortifications. But the Russians would be able to, with the capture of Nevelske, go on to expand the zone of control in this area and prevent Ukrainian counterattacks from the flanks, which is likely what they're looking for, having a secure flank, which would allow the Russians to push through Pervomaisky with all their efforts without worrying about the Ukrainians countering those advances. Moving further south here in the direction of Krasnodarivka, there's been yet another advance as Russians are now facing off against this fortification to the south of Krasnodarivka, and they have now gained a foothold within the city. With this, we see that the Russians are serious about these advancements here to the south of Krasnodarivka, and they'll likely look to capture the fortifications and the south of this train station here, allowing them to gain a proper foothold within the city before pushing onwards. The city of Krasnodarivka is unlike other cities because this one is extremely heavily fortified, and even within the city there are lines of fortifications. As such, the Russians will have a very difficult time pushing through it, so they need proper supply lines going to and from the city and a proper foothold to establish positions and develop the situation further in the future. Therefore, we see that the Russians will likely look to gain control over the southern fortifications here, allowing them to move through and from the fortifications and the roads here to the south. But they would also need to expand their zone of control here to the east to secure their flank. This is the more tricky part, this is the more difficult part, because the Russians would have to push through several layers of Ukrainian fortifications. This raises the question as to how the Russians plan on doing this. Will they do a pincer maneuver from both sides, where they'll be attacking the Ukrainian fortifications from both sides? Will they be attacking straight from down south, or all three at the same time? This would allow them to simply overrun the Ukrainians by having a lot of units, and the Ukrainian fortifications being limited due to their nature of defending against one specific direction, instead now having to defend against not just one direction but three directions, which makes it very difficult. And with the Russian proximity to the fortifications all throughout here, the eastern parts of Krasnodarivka, it is likely that they will heavily bombard the area. The Ukrainians also have artillery nearby, but the Russians, with the control over Marinka and these southern parts right here, further away from the front line than the Ukrainian positions by Krasnodarivka, would allow them to heavily bombard Krasnodarivka, and the Ukrainians, with the lack of artillery shells in the first place, would have a difficult time responding. And that is likely exactly why the Russians decided to attack Krasnodarivka at this point in time, because the Ukrainians are still suffering from a lack of artillery shells, which means that all of these fortifications would be much easier to fight through with the Ukrainians running low on artillery ammunition than if they had a lot to spare. As such, the Russians are looking now to capture Krasnodarivka while the Ukrainians are still weakened. Moving on to the south here by Priodne, the Ukrainians launched a small counterattack here in the forest lines and forest patches, regaining some territories the Russians captured in January. Moving on to the Robotyne direction, the Ukrainians launched yet another counterattack where they regained full control over Robotyne and the fortifications here to the south of the village. This was also confirmed by recent drone footage from the Ukrainian side, showing them recapturing these trenches here to the south of the village. And with this, the Russians were completely pushed out of the village, and the Ukrainians have regained full control of it. The Ukrainian side managed to do this with reinforcements arriving from the rear. They have received reinforcements in the name of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, which arrived about 10 days ago, the 5th Tank Brigade, which arrived yesterday, and finally the 116th Mechanized Brigade, arriving a week ago. So these three brigades are in addition to the brigades already operating there, allowing the Ukrainians to counterattack and recapture some positions by Robotyne, completely recapturing the village itself. And with this, the Russians have a significant pressure by the Ukrainians due to the heavy assaults by the Ukrainian forces in the area, with these new tank and mechanized brigades as well as assault brigades, allowing the Ukrainians to have this variety of units working together and dealing with the Russians while they are trying to get a foothold in a village that doesn't really have any buildings. So it's very difficult for the Russians to gain control over Robotyne due to the significant forces of the Ukrainians. However, the Ukrainians sending this many forces to the area means that there's a lot of targets on the Ukrainian side. Due to the Russian artillery working heavily in the area, the Ukrainians could suffer a lot of casualties due to the amount of troops in the area. Especially considering the fact that no buildings in Robotyne goes both ways. The Ukrainians can't either hold any positions in Robotyne other than the trenches in the northern parts due to the lack of buildings in the area. And with that, additional Ukrainian forces would be sitting in trenches or in the rear, because the Russians attacking them would be fatal if the artillery simply just overwhelms the Ukrainian forces in the area without fortifications or buildings or anywhere to stay in cover of the artillery. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.